Welcome to Props and Hops, a podcast pursuing the best in betting and beer. I'm your host, Matt Landis, and as we approach 5 years since PASPA was repealed, that date being May 14th of 2018, thought this could be a good opportunity to take a deep dive into the state of legalized betting. No better person I could think of with which to have that conversation than good friend of the show, Mike Roselli. Mike is an attorney. He's also the host of the Doggy Juice podcast. If you've listened to this show regularly over the years, you've probably heard him at least a time or two. Mike, welcome back to Props and Hops.
Thanks for having me back, Matt. I'm so excited to be on. 5 years away now from when our lives all changed. I'll never forget. It was a Monday morning. I was in Seattle, May 14th, and I woke up with my wife and I were, at the time she was my girlfriend, but now wife. We were on a vacation out in the Pacific Northwest. I had actually reached out to you at the time to get some beer recs out there. Woke up to the news, completely changed our whole trip, and then immediately, within like a day or two, there was billboards up in my hometown of Chicago and here in Illinois. The gold rush had began, and now we are 5 years to the day soon from when our lives all changed. So I'm looking forward to looking back with you and being back on the pod today.
When you say it totally changed the complexion of your vacation, I'm curious as to how your then girlfriend, now wife Christina, responded to your exuberance to some big news, but nevertheless, when you were supposed to be kind of breaking away from all that and spending some quality time with her.
Yeah, she's used to it. At that point, I was already like completely, all in on sports betting. We knew it was going to come too. I mean, we all knew that even people that were paying attention at a low level, just keeping their ears on the pulse, like knew that the Supreme Court decision was coming. So just happened to happen on that vacation, and it set things back a little bit. But luckily, Seattle is such good food. There's a lot of opportunities to make your significant other happy there by treating them to a nice meal, and the seafood out there kept her happy. So we were all happy on that trip.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to see how happy you've remained over the course of the past 5 years, give or take, since PASPA was repealed. Given your expectations when we got that big news 5 years ago, what do you think that you've been most right about over that time? And what would you say maybe you've gotten most wrong with your expectations on the day PASPA went away?
That's a good question. It's amazing to look back and think about where we all thought it was going to go at that time. I feel like the macro environment has really had a huge impact on the proliferation of sports betting and iGaming in general since that fateful day. So I think the thing I got most right was just just this gold rush that we're experiencing, fast rollouts, tons of confusion on the regulatory side, because it really is a state by state basis. And people are quick to forget that the PASPA case, that whole Supreme Court decision, was a federalism issue. They weren't really looking at anything else besides just the state's ability to decide on their end what they wanted to do with sports betting. And so once you saw that come down, that decision, some states were quick to move, like Delaware. Obviously, they were actually the next state to launch, the first state to launch post-PASPA, right before New Jersey. But you saw the sheer amount of just fast rollouts. It was a big gold rush. People were just wanting to get in the game, and a lot of us saw that coming. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. But we're really entering a new stage now, and I feel like what I've got most right is kind of how things have adjusted over time. We saw that initial gold rush that I always like to call stage one. Everyone just wanted to get involved, and you saw these parties from outside the U.S. come in, Europeans and Australians that have been doing it for years come in and want to bring in their way of doing things. Stage two, you kind of saw come in when the SPAC markets were drying up. You saw a lot more M&A in the space. I probably even mentioned this in my last podcast appearance here, where we saw that really the past year and a half or year, a lot of books over extending themselves and dropping out of the game. You've seen some M&A, some books get gobbled up by others. And now we're entering that interesting third stage where I feel like we're 5 years in, and stage three is we're going to see a lot of changes in just the very way that we bet. And I think a lot of it's going to be centered around tech and tech compliance. A lot of these new exciting companies are going to come. So I've kind of nailed that, the timeline on where we're going with things. What I think I got most wrong, to be honest, is just the notion of ego touching this industry. I know I talked about this on the last pod too, but I think I underestimated how some of these companies and third parties really came in and thought that their way of doing things was the right way, and just how many stakeholders are involved as well. Having been on the sportsbook side and my time over at PlayUp running the PlayUp book, the online sportsbook there, was amazing to see, and I underestimated how many stakeholders, how many third parties are involved in this, like from KYC to geolocation. You got your payment processors, your audits, your ops providers. There's so many different moving parts that all have to move in sync. And then when you throw in different state by state rules, and the rules and regulations by state differ, it creates a situation where there's a lot of confusion and a lot of stop and go and a lot of inefficiency. So unfortunately, that's still very much here. And a lot of that is because of the ego and the whole notion of ego in the industry. But I'm hopeful that'll get a little bit better the next few years.
I'm glad that over the course of that answer, you touched a bit on the scope of PASPA, and I might have put the cart before the horse to kick off the conversation. But just to give some context for a moment, with your background as an attorney, as a sports bettor, tell us a little bit about somebody who might not have that legal expertise to better understand what PASPA was intended to do while it was active, and really maybe what it means and what it doesn't necessarily mean, even though it's been repealed.
So when I was a young kid, I'm a huge NBA nut fan. Like I grew up loving Michael Jordan. Bill Bradley, who was a U.S. senator at the time, he's a former NBA player. He's the one who ushered in PASPA, the PASPA law, the protection of amateur and professional sports I'm butchering the name, whatever. Protecting stakeholders in the industry. That was in 1992. And
Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act.
That's it. Yes. Hopefully no regulators are listening or something. Anyway. But so Bill Bradley ushered that in. He was a former player, and essentially that created, without going too much into it, it created a scenario where only states that were offering sports betting can continue to do so, but no one else can do it. And essentially Nevada was the only state at the time doing it. There are some nuances. Some states had an opportunity at that point to lock some stuff in, but didn't. So it made Nevada the only game in town. This was unfair, and it went unchecked for quite a while. But New Jersey, you have to credit New Jersey and the administration there for pushing the envelope. And they essentially, the whole iGaming launch back, probably talking like 12 years ago, that initiated some changes. And then you saw a change to the state law where New Jersey wanted to legalize sports betting and challenged it on a federal level. And the Supreme Court then looked at the case. It became really evident in 2017. There was a lot of backing from, ironically, we could go down a rabbit hole here if we want to, but the sports leagues and the way that they completely shifted on the whole issue, because the irony was the sports leagues were literally parties to the case against the state of New Jersey, trying to block New Jersey from bringing sports betting. But Adam Silver, you have to tip the cap to him, NBA commissioner. His op-ed in the New York Times really helped change the tide, change the way people looked at it a little bit. That was instrumental, I think. So you saw that weird shift in 2017 where you kind of knew that it was inevitable that this was unconstitutional from a federalism perspective. States should be able to choose this. I mean, you look at other issues that are similar, and states on a state-by-state basis are able to choose what they want their citizens to do or what they want to ban their citizens from doing. And this is a federal overreach. And fortunately for everyone, the Supreme Court saw it the same way, not unanimously, and essentially allowed the states to choose on that ruling in May 2018 whether or not they wanted to legalize it. We've seen 37 legalize it since.
And I think of a parallel between legalizing sports betting, legalizing marijuana across different parts of the country. Just because certain federal laws occur doesn't mean that suddenly sports betting is legal everywhere. Just like it doesn't mean that now, no matter where somebody is, even if marijuana is legal, they can just walk down the street and smoke it. Or if because some places allow it, other places might not. So I see a bit of a parallel in that sense, and it seems to just continue to proliferate the connection we could make there.
Yes, and you're touching on something too. That's another big industry issue right now, is that confusion that comes in when some of this, when PASPA was overturned in 2018, states were able to choose, but then people don't understand what is a legal sports book. And you saw some opportunistic offshore sites and offshore operators that are operating in the gray area kind of prey on that a little bit. And some people that were confused, like Talking Heads, you saw some, I think it was an ESPN employee a couple of years ago that was literally a Bovada spokesperson, was doing branded advertising with Bovada on her Twitter and our shows. And that puts out the wrong message, because a lot of people that don't know better might think that, hey, you can legally bet on Bovada or Bet Online or some of these offshore sites here in the U.S. that do cater to U.S. customers. It created a lot of confusion there, and it still exists in this, and it has not been fixed as much as I would have liked to. So you see like a free for all When states are able to decide whether or not to do it, doesn't mean just everyone gets the green light and everyone and their uncle could just open up shop. No, it actually makes it more difficult, actually, because if you're going to do it in a regulated legal environment, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through. And unfortunately, and I feel like we could get into this now, is some states have not been getting that right at all, and you're seeing the results of that now.
And to that point, what would you say across the country, certain states, looking at the betting industry from a macro level, what would you classify as some of the biggest wins and some of the biggest missed opportunities over these first 5 years post-PASPA?
Yeah, the biggest wins, obviously for bettors and consumer protection, it's huge, because we actually, there is recourse, and you could argue how good the recourse is in some states, but if you have, a payment issue, you could actually go to a regulator now and have your voice heard. Whereas, if an offshore site decides to keep your money for whatever reason, there's not much you can do. You can't go to any law enforcement here in the U.S. So that's a big win. I think the consumer protections, obviously, as bettors, having more outs, it's huge. Although on the flip side, a lot of these new books are unfortunately, one of the biggest industry issues of the past 5 years. And beating a dead horse here is, cutting customers limits sometimes, and most of the time when they shouldn't be. That's, with that exception, there are more outs for us as bettors, so that's huge. And just lifting the veil on the whole industry, I think, is huge as well. Obviously, you and I were into sports betting many years before PASPA was overturned, but now it's all out in the open, almost too much so. And that's probably one of the biggest misses that we've seen. It's just the way it's covered, from just a, you see like a lot of books obviously doing their own marketing, which is a huge problem as well. The lack of education in the space. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about ego at the beginning. You're seeing a lot of stakeholders insist on doing things their way. Maybe they were doing it in another jurisdiction or in Europe, but that doesn't necessarily translate here. You see regulators insist on doing things their own way. You see some there's one lawmaker, not even a regulator, an actual lawmaker in Minnesota, who's calling himself the godfather of sports gambling. They haven't legalized it yet. You get a lot of ego in this industry, and you see some states, unfortunately, just completely missing the bus on this. Tennessee is a great example. What they just did is making me completely pull my hair out. By now, they're going to be taxing handle, which you didn't see any state even want to go down that path. You saw some introductions of that idea early on, but then fortunately cooler heads prevailed. But now Tennessee's backtracking and starting to tax handle. And
can you explain the repercussions of Tennessee making that decision, what that could mean for the industry and for bettors at the end of the day?
Yes. Yeah. I'm very, very bearish on that decision, as much as you can be. Already you're starting to see -117 on both sides. Inevitably, when you create a situation like this, I mean, Montana is another perfect example. When there's no competition, that's a separate issue, but there's only one game in town. You could obviously offer whatever price you want. The misunderstanding and the short-sightedness here really comes down to longevity of something like that. When you are taxing on handle like Tennessee's doing now, they're, instead of taxing on hold, there's a reason why they made this change too. They had the asinine law. Sorry for I don't want to be too mean to them, but when the law was passed in Tennessee, they call for a 10% mandatory hold for sports books. As we know, sports betting is a low margin business, and it's 5-6% hold if you're lucky, if you're running a good business. And books were never going to handle 10%. They haven't been. So they've been given the choice in Tennessee, and there's other nuances in Tennessee too. There's a change in regulator, but books were given the choice. Do they want to pay a fine or true up their accounts? So they're paying the 10% hold. They're all choosing just to pay the fine instead. And this is creating a shortfall in what they thought they were going to bring in revenue in Tennessee. So now they went back to the law, and they're taxing on handle, which is just total money taken in. When that happens, sports books have to start passing the cost on to someone, because you can't be profitable when you're obviously taxing that much in handle, or even that much in hold, 10% in hold. So inevitably, you have to, in order to combat that, you have to change your pricing. And the result of that is you're seeing sports bettors presented with odds that are a lot worse in the regulated market than they can find either in a regulated market right next to Tennessee, or even easier, inside their homes on an offshore website. So when you have -110 on both sides, and you're trying to bet on the Titans this fall offshore, and then you log on to your Caesars account and you're seeing -117, a lot of people are going to be bringing their money back to the black market and offshore. And that completely circumvents the very purpose of legalizing sports betting, and regulating it is to keep everything above board. You're able to monitor irregular betting patterns and irregular line moves, and nefarious activity. But more importantly, bring in more money for taxpayers and in the form of taxes on sports betting revenue. And that's going to be lost. So don't be surprised if you see total handle go down in Tennessee, especially this fall, and for them to walk back this very poor decision in the coming months. And probably it'll take a year or two, who knows? But I'm very confident they're going to realize this was a very bad idea, and they're going to be very disappointed about this decision in Tennessee. And I'm off my soapbox.
Well, it's good we got that out into the open, because I was going to ask about any recent developments that you've been following the most closely. I think Tennessee, that situation kind of speaks for itself with what you just offered to us. And to make things a bit forward looking at the same time, are there any upcoming developments that you're most anticipating?
Yes. So I mean, it's the news cycle in sports betting. That's the other thing. Like there's been times where like there's so many news stories that'll be like enough on their own before PASPA was overturned to like be front page news. Now it's like every day there's something new. And just this week, the crackdown on marketing, I think it's and responsible gaming. That's kind of been like the story of the industry this year. I know we talked about it the last time I was on here, so I won't dive into the whole focus on RG, and especially the states like Ohio and Massachusetts have fortunately reignited, or not even reignited, ignited for the first time a very important conversation. But you're seeing I guess it's interesting now coming on here, whatever, a month and a half later after we had that chat last time, you're seeing the result of some of this thinking by regulators and some of this poking by regulators, and that's hitting companies like Barstool with a big decision they had to make. Obviously, Penn being the parent company, deciding to fire that one employee for I didn't watch the clip, but I guess he had a swear word that he said on there that was unacceptable, and he apologized, but it wasn't good enough for Penn. They're worried about their licenses, and you're seeing that kind of that I don't want to say knee-jerk reaction, but just the natural pendulum swing in the industry right now, when a lot of these books went largely unchecked, didn't check themselves on their marketing practices and some of the deceptive wording they would use in their advertising. And now we're seeing the other shoe drop in terms of the reaction, and maybe there's a lot more nerves from the Penn side in that example. Obviously, they're very worried about their licensing and maybe a hammer being brought down on them in Massachusetts or other states. But that's certainly a fascinating development, because it's coming at a time where you're seeing a lot of changes on the sportsbook side, and some books that are maybe giving up their torch in the industry, like a PointsBet looking to get acquired by someone. So it's coming at an interesting time for a company like Barstool that's really disappointed, I think, in their role. I think they're like only capturing like 3 to 5% market share, and a lot of people thought it would be a lot higher early on. And so it's an interesting case study there. The other big thing that I'm going to be watching is just this week, Michigan wrote a letter to the Attorney General. So basically, the executive director of the Michigan Gaming Control Board wrote a letter to the federal, to the AG, obviously federal government, the DOJ, and 6 states joined, essentially calling for more of a crackdown on offshore sports books. And you saw this crackdown on the poker world about just a little over 10 years ago on Black Friday. I'm sure a lot of your listeners remember that. But you're seeing this renewed push, and it's nothing new. The AGA did send a similar letter to the DOJ last year, but it's interesting now because you might see, including my home state of Illinois, they hopped on that letter. There's a lot of backing for this, so you might see some movement there on a federal level with the crackdown on some of these offshore sites. And it's got me a little worried, but it's also and you could argue it's a good development in some aspects as well.
And as not just an attorney, but as a bettor, I'm going to ask you to maybe set the line on this. You made a comparison to Black Monday in the poker world. What are the odds, in your opinion, right now, given what you know, that we see something remotely similar in the offshore sports betting world in the near-term future?
That's a good question. Near-term future being like next year or two, I would probably say less than 10, 20%. Probably not that high at all. But you never know. A lot of this comes down to politics too, and that's something I try to remove myself from that. But we do have an election coming up next year, and that's always a consideration. Weaving in certain decisions based off the political agendas, for better or worse, of politicians. A lot of it will depend on that. Maybe all it takes is a couple important lawmakers and people with pull to really make it one certain issue move fast. I don't think there's any indication that it's going to be something that happens quickly, but at the same time, things can happen fast, especially like single events. And one single event in any industry can spark a lot of change. So hopefully it doesn't come to that, but I would say it's a low likelihood that anytime soon we see any sort of crackdown. It's hard to enforce stuff like that too. It'll take a lot of work and certainly a lot of time.
And I think I said Black Monday earlier. If I'm correct, in the poker world, it might have been Black Friday.
Black Friday. I might have said Black Monday too.
April 15th, 2011.
Yeah. There you go. There's a lot of dates to remember now.
Thank you, Google, for the assist. Yeah, we got April 15th, 2011 is infamous, and May 14th, 2018 with the PASPA repeal can be a bit more celebratory. And while there has been some stuff to celebrate, I also think a good phrase to summarize a lot of your thoughts thus far have been kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, if you will. Plenty to follow with the states that are already up and running. And to your point, the offshore markets aren't totally dead yet. I guess one point before we move on from the offshore conversation, I think of guys like Piskey and Fulldog, the Banfield group. They talk about not keeping too much money in certain accounts, just because if anything happens and you don't have any recourse, you don't want to be, out just left holding the bag if there's too much riding there. So any thoughts? I know you're in Illinois where there is some regulated betting opportunity in your backyard. At the same time, if somebody's betting offshore and they're doing well, then maybe they don't want to let those accounts get too inflated and let too much money sit there indefinitely.
Yes. No, that's very smart thinking there. If I happen to have a lot of money on offshore accounts, I would be taking a hard look at that. There's obviously certain things you can do to protect that money, and I'll leave it at that. But it is definitely something that you should have in the back of your mind, really at the front of your mind right now as we navigate all of this, because like I said, things could happen very quickly. All it takes is one event, and you're staring a really bad situation in the face. You don't want to be one of those guys that's got money tied up somewhere where you can't access it, and it's hard enough to collect, as we all know, in the betting world. So if you could control it, you can, and that's something you could certainly work to control now. So that's good advice.
And speaking of having money tied up in a place where you can't access it, I'm hoping as somebody in California that before too long there could be legitimately viable options in a regulated market. I think of the big 3, not just California, but Texas and Florida in a similar spot. And those states could really have a lot of say in what happens at a broader level in the sports betting industry across the country. What's your current outlook on that big 3, so to speak, as you look toward the foreseeable future for California, Texas, and Florida?
Not very good. I wish I had better news there. Honestly, California, you can actually make a legitimate argument that they, and by they I mean all the stakeholders involved, set everything further back last fall with the referendum, the 2 proposed amendments that were not passed, or the 2 propositions that were emphatically not passed. I think that the one prop that was favorable for your stereotypical operators in DraftKings, FanDuel it was like such a low yes rate on the votes, and obviously a lot of that comes down to like the wording of the props and the sheer amount of spending that went on the side of the tribes was very eye-opening. So I think if we've learned anything from last fall, it's that the tribes hold all the power in California, and unfortunately that's really the case in Florida as well. Although Florida's a little more interesting, I'll get to that in a sec. But California, I think we're in a spot where like it's take the over, especially if it's the next couple of years on sports betting, at least mobile sports betting being an option. People are going to have to come together, and some people are going to have to cave on both sides in order to get this done, because it's unfortunately a situation where the tribes are they can play hardball and continue to wait, and they hold all the cards. Florida's a little more interesting because obviously we've touched on this in the past. They launched briefly in at the end of 2021 and then pulled it back. It's interesting to follow because the DC Court of Appeals heard oral arguments it was actually in December. And they're going to have a decision at some point this year on the Seminole Tribe's exclusive jurisdiction in the state. It is a bit nuanced there, but they hold a lot of the power, one certain tribe in Florida, and it comes down to the gaming compact there. But we will have at least some sort of resolution there. So I'm a little bit more bullish on Florida, especially since it's technically like legal, or it's just not. I mean, it's a little more nuanced because it's been passed to a certain extent. Just need to be legal when they actually offer it. Texas, it's so hard because there was momentum, but then you saw like some of the bigger stakeholders kind of backtrack a little bit. You saw a bunch of bills get introduced, but nothing got pushed through, and their legislative sessions are so short that and such a small window to get it done. Where I think we're looking at, not even talking about Texas again until next year as being a possibility, and that's just to legalize, not launch. And that's a whole separate issue, is launching after legalizing. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see any betting in either of those three big states this year or next year.
All right, so let's not hold our breath for the big three to get their act together anytime soon. But that said, looking at things from a more glass half full type of approach, Circa coming to Illinois pretty soon. I know a lot of people have a lot of good things to see about the way that they do business. What are your thoughts on the future of having access to a book like that in your home state?
I'm so pumped about Circa coming. I mean, I love Circa. I've been supporting them since day one. It's funny because they were saying about a year ago at this time that they were looking at Q3 of 2022 to launch, and always said take the over on a regulatory approval, especially when it's my home state here in Illinois. So they're about a year later, and that was to be expected. Even when they circled back and said, yeah, probably early 2023, I was like, I'm not going to hold my breath on that. There's a lot of hoops to jump through on the licensing side and on the approval side, but it looks like they're all set to come before fall, and I'm really looking forward to it because Illinois bettors are going to be finally treated to the best experience that they can get. I'm going to caveat that though, and I'm a huge Circa supporter, but a lot of people are going to hear me say this, and they're going to come back to me this fall and say, what are you talking about, Mike? This app sucks. The user experience leaves a lot to be desired. And I'll say this to anyone at Circus, they know this as well. It's not breaking any news there. It's a very bare bones app. And a lot of people that are used to FanDuel, DraftKings over here in Illinois, and that experience they're not going to be impressed at all when the Circa app comes. But I think that you and I know this more than anybody, or maybe not everybody, but the customer service is literally second to none. And the longevity of Circa is something that I'm obviously going to buy into. Maybe they won't catch an early, home run when it comes to, capturing market share here in Illinois. I mean, it might be similar to Iowa. They're not really impressing in Iowa at all, for really mainly for those reasons. The app just not having all the bells and whistles that you would expect. But the longevity, I don't doubt for a second. And I feel like you might have a situation 5 to 10 years where DraftKings, FanDuel aren't even in the sports betting game because they couldn't cut it. But Circa and a couple other brands are the ones that are on top as this market continues to mature and we enter new stages on and just overall proliferation of sports betting in the U.S. So Circa will come. They probably won't knock people's socks off early on, but they will be here to stay. I'm very confident of that.
So overall, very positive vibe on Circa coming to Illinois, but I appreciate the measured approach, trying to be fair. And I would like to underscore that, well, I've also had a lot of good things to say about the way they operate over the years here. I think that if somebody is looking for transparent limits, the ability to get down significant amounts if their bankroll allows for it, and like you said, customer service, in those areas, from my somewhat decent experience, I like to think Circa is second to none. I feel like I can say quite confidently. And as you said, from a user interface perspective, or a lot of people who might just like that DraftKings might not be the sharpest book, but they're often first to offer props or certain obscure markets and have much bigger menus. Circa is not the place for the most expansive menus. So for certain recreational players who aren't limited to $7.13 at certain recreational books, maybe it's not going to move the needle. But for the more serious bettors, I do think that Circa is going to have plenty to offer. So in the spirit of offering a balanced approach, I wanted to chime in with that as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, from the bettor standpoint, it's a home run having Circa come here because, like you said, the transparent limits is really something that not many are doing out there. I mean, I know my time at Play Up, we tried to do that, but obviously we weren't taking the bets that Circa's taking and didn't have the experience in-house, not even in the same stratosphere. So it's huge for bettors for them to be here. People that are doing things the right way. Hopefully that rubs off a little bit on any of the entities in here, any of the stakeholders here in Illinois and Chicago where I'm at. But yeah, I mean, if half my friends here in Chicago aren't even good bettors and they're still restricted to $2 on BetMGM or any of the Canby books. So just right off the bat, having that extra out that can get down a certain amount at a certain time is very, very huge, very worthwhile. And I'm just hoping that they go through all hopefully the tech issues aren't too crazy for them early on, because I think it's going to be a volume like they've never seen before, like in Iowa or Colorado. It's just going to pale in comparison to what they're going to see here in Chicago.
All right. Well, I think thus far in the conversation, we've tapped heavily into your legal expertise, and this could give us a good opportunity to parlay that with a lot of what sports bettors are paying attention to beyond the regulatory side of things, or maybe where the regulatory side of things and the core of sports betting really comes together and has some overlap. And I'd like to touch on the NFL in particular. You mentioned early on in this conversation a few years ago, pre-PASPA repeal, they were one of the biggest advocates for not rolling out regulated, widely accessible sports betting.
It's
And
funny how it
now,
changed.
yeah, it's funny how
So
once they
funny.
get their slice of the pie and see how the money can stack up, their opinions can change. Who would have thought? But it's hard to deny that now, in a lot of ways, they're in bed with some of these sports books. And yet we've seen now several instances of players getting suspended for certain violations, some of which might be more egregious than others. So I know it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But overall, Mike, with, again, your legal expertise and your sports betting experience and knowledge, what's your point of view on leagues like the NFL getting in bed with books and also really cracking down on players for sometimes legitimate reasons, sometimes maybe not so legitimate reasons to be so harsh?
Yeah, it's the hypocrisy is just, it's laughable. So and we've known that for a couple of years now. It's be beating a dead horse to bring that up again. How the NFL just quickly switched, and all the other sports leagues for that matter just switch sides, and now they're signing deals left and right. You're seeing literally bets getting taken in NFL stadiums now, which is very cool. The fact that they've embraced it is awesome, and the fact that integrity fees haven't, fortunately for all of us, haven't become the norm is also a nice development. But yeah, when it comes to it's just perception is such an important thing, especially early on in this industry. I think that's the main thing that a lot of people kind of lose sight of right now. Is we all know, but like a lot of us that are entrenched in sports betting in this space, we know how things work. But the perception of the common layman paying attention and reading the headline articles or some of the stuff going out there in the mainstream news, it's important to get this right, because perception is reality for a lot of people, and the stigma associated with some of this is still very real. So when it comes to rules for players, I mean, and I know that we wanted to chat about that news that just happened with some players coming out that they literally were betting on NFL games. There's no excuse for that. I don't have much sympathy for an NFL player betting on NFL games. The rules are very clear. They're posted up in every locker room, and they should know better. When it comes down to some of the other rules they have, I'll start by saying rules are rules. It's your job to know the rules. There's no excuse for not knowing them. But when the rules are unreasonable, I think everyone needs to take a hard look at some of this. And you saw this happen the NFL with that one player being suspended for making a wager on, not on NFL, but on the team property. You have to take a look at
Jamison Williams.
Yeah,
I think we're getting. He was pretty noteworthy, first round pick last year, and showed some signs of promise when he came back. So not just the betting angle, but what he's meant to contribute to a team that's now favored to win the NFC North. That could be a big deal on the field. So back to the rules, but also to keep in mind a pretty prominent player caught up in all this now.
Yes, yeah, and obviously they brought the hammer down on him. I get the rules. I'm all for following them, especially as an attorney, because once you start carving stuff out, carving out exceptions, things get a little more murky. Having said that, this is a perfect time for us to, and by us, I mean all industry stakeholders, but really the leagues in particular, and I guess the NFL in particular, just because there's so many more NFL players versus your NBA or take your pick. But you have to take a hard look at these rules and what's reasonable. And these athletes are people just like us. They have lives, and a lot of the time, going back to the whole notion of ego, a lot of these athletes, they play sports, they want to bet on sports. I think they know sports. As we know, that knowing a sport or playing a sport, if anything, it might give you a false sense of hope. As the best bettors we know can't name a couple players in an entire league. So, but we have to adapt with the times. Things are changing quickly. Obviously, people are starting to do a lot more stuff on their phones, a lot more interacting and betting on their phones. So kind of changing these rules to change with the times and fit with the times is important as well. So I'm hopeful that this whole conversation isn't going to be misreported on, and also for what's happening on the Alabama baseball scenario too. You really hope that some of the journalists and the sports reporters covering these issues don't blow it out of proportion, that they're educated on what's happening, because all this is good for the industry, because bringing it above board, regulating it, can uncover some of this stuff. You're not able to know what you don't know when this stuff's in the black market or in the gray market. So I think it's important for us all to kind of, and everyone, just to kind of work with adjust with the times, work with what you got, but also be willing to communicate and make rules that are actually like going to work and be reasonable, because we're in a situation now where you're seeing a top player that's going to be sitting out where he really probably did nothing wrong, but it was a technicality, and you don't want that to be the end result of some of this stuff too. So I'm hopeful that cooler heads prevail over time.
You mentioned Alabama baseball as well. I don't mean to point the finger just at the NFL. And in this case with Alabama baseball, it was pretty egregious. I mean, if I've got my facts in order, the coach of the team was communicating with a bettor as he was placing bets against Alabama baseball. So that's a pretty clear way to cross the line. And when it comes to the notion, like you touched on, the perception here, the integrity of the game, a very common talking point. Oftentimes, I feel like I hear more about integrity of the game as a rallying cry against regulated sports betting. And on one hand, I get it, because some of these scandals can really be a black eye to the industry. But at the same time, as you talked about with certain things being out in the open, in some ways, the integrity of the game probably couldn't be any stronger with a more strongly regulated market across much of the country.
Right. And some of this is inevitable, because this is just a result of bringing everything above board and easily disseminating information today too. So I feel like we're basically in a situation where it's as important as ever before to report on this correctly. And maybe there's no excuse for what that coach did. I mean, if he's giving that info out, he should be punished. And the irony is, as we know, like baseball, college baseball, you can't get down much, but the amount that you're betting should be irrelevant, I think, when it comes to integrity as well. Because going back to the whole perception is reality thing, I'm just hopeful that it's going to all be covered responsibly, like this whole issue that we're seeing play out in the investigation in real time. But it's also important to note that this is the exact thing that a regulated market is designed to do. The U.S. Integrity, Matt Holt and his team, they do great things over there, and this is exactly what you would hope would happen, that they would be able to spot irregular betting patterns and point that out to the regulator, and the regulators communicate that amongst themselves, and then you can act accordingly. If you don't have this above board, and you don't have Matt Holt and the U.S. Integrity team monitoring this stuff all goes unchecked. So I hope it's not sensationalized by the media, I guess is what I'm really getting at, especially unnecessarily. There's no sign that any of the players did anything, or there's no other nefarious activity, and really not many bets were even taken. From my understanding, I think we might all laugh when we find out about the actual amount of money that was got down on this, because I've heard it's at a book that's known for not taking many bets. So, but like I said, the dollar amount bet shouldn't be relevant here. The integrity of the game is relevant, and this is a perfect example of a regulated industry doing what it's designed to do.
And when it comes to what's at stake for all involved here, I think for the leagues, again, we can laugh about how easily they'll do a 180 on their stance once a truck full of money shows up at their door. And on the other hand, you can't put a price on the perception of these games being above board, the integrity of the game. So all things considered, Mike, again, 5 years post-PASPA, what's your thought on the future of leagues and governing bodies across sports having relationships with sportsbooks?
It's going to be interesting because of that perception. I think I would love to see a world where there's not as much involvement, but I think it's inevitable that we're going to see. I mean, they're going to be intertwined, whether we like it or not. And I feel like we're going down a path. I hope we're going down a path where we're able to watch a game live without any latency, like any long delays, and make bets, maybe embedded with the broadcast. Maybe we could do that, but we are up against it in the sense that there's that perception that people are starting to worry about a little bit. And I think it all comes down to educating the consumer, educating obviously lawmakers and regulators, as we know, but educating the leagues and the people involved making decisions there as well. And everybody that, the talking heads that they hire as well. It's very important. I've always thought that there's just a natural disconnect when you see some of these sports books that are partnered with the leagues, then pushing certain bets a certain way. As you and I know, there's probably no nefarious activity there, but it comes down to that perception and that stigma associated with it. So I personally don't like seeing that. And you can also say what you will about the type of content that some of these books are putting out and leaving a lot to be desired. That's a separate issue. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And I think we're going to see a little bit of maybe not a knee-jerk reaction, but a pendulum swing, so to speak, in terms of how how the leagues are perceived and their involvement with the sports books. There probably should be a little added layer there. Who knows? Maybe it doesn't exist yet, but I think we might see some changes. At the same time, the leagues are here to stay with sports betting. Sports betting's not going anywhere, especially when you have sports books in the stadium. So finding a way to embrace that relationship while also governing and regulating the correct way that's the right answer, but it's going to take time to get there. We're 5 years into this, so it's going to be really interesting 5-10 years from now when we look back at this conversation and be like, oh my God, we were doing it that way before, but it's just part of the natural path that we're on.
Yeah, 5 years can sound like a long time in some contexts, and in other contexts, it could really be the infancy here. So plenty still to come. And you touched on education across a variety of stakeholders is a key component of the future of this industry. And when it comes to consumers, whom you mentioned, a lot of it could rely on certain people educating consumers properly so that consumers can be, maybe in a more passive way, taking in the right information. And at the same time, for consumers who really care about this, it might be hard to know where to start, what the best sources could be to get good information and how to stay up to speed, getting reputable info from reputable people. So Mike, what would some of your top tips be for people who are interested in this to follow the state of legalized gambling, but might not have any sort of legal expertise in their backgrounds?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of good resources out there. I would say follow the Doggy Juice podcast, my pod, but I'm not as guaranteed on the frequency of the episodes, or it's not like a weekly cadence right now. But there are good resources. I'm not being paid to say this, but Legal Sports Report does a great job, and Sports Handle. Those are my two favorites in terms of like covering the day-to-day aspects of the state-by-state developments, not just on legalization, but on issues happening in the industry. So checking out the Legal Sports Report, that's a good way to go. They do a great job of covering everything, and Sports Handle as well. I would 100% make those a part of your process.
All right, and one small addition I'll make. I catch it in small bite-sized bits here and there, but the Gamble On podcast will often do a good job staying on top of what's up. So if somebody wants something that, just in short form updates on a regular cadence, that's one more that I'll add to the mix.
Yeah, that's a great one. There's some people on Twitter that do a great job of covering it too, like Ryan Butler. I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with him. He does a good job of summarizing everything. And there's some other guys out there too that do a really good job.
And I think I know Ryan Butler's handle, but I'm making sure. Yeah, at Butler Bets for anybody who wants to tap into Mike's recommendation there. And Mike, speaking of your recommendations, not just on the legalization side of things, but now really digging into the betting side of life, NFL futures are all the talk this time of year. The draft is in the rearview mirror. A lot of people champing at the bit for the season to begin in a few months. And I know that for some sharp bettors, tying up bankroll for an extended period of time, even if there's an edge to be had, might not be worth it. At the same time, there might be numbers that people can get in pocket now or at various points throughout an off season that you can't beat if you wait too long, and you might end up missing the boat altogether. So when it comes to the somewhat polarizing topic of NFL futures betting across much of gambling Twitter, how would you describe your approach?
Yeah, so obviously everyone has different approaches. Early on, like pre-draft, like that little pocket of time between the Super Bowl ending and the NFL draft, I'm not doing much. I'm really just looking for rogue numbers, but anything I'm going to do is it's going to be finding opportunities based off player news. So like a good the Bucks a few years ago is an example. I got them 50-1 before Brady came over. Brady coming had nothing to do with that line move. That team was primed and ready to go. Brady, he could have put any replacement level. I firmly believe this, probably not a popular opinion, but I feel like they could have brought in pretty much anybody with a pulse and it would have been good. But Brady obviously moved the market once he came. So getting down on Bucks 50-1 when that news was swirling was stuff like that. An example for this year is the Jets. We got the Jets at 40-1 on Jan 28 on Caesars because there was the rumors of the Rodgers news and I wanted to get ahead of it, and the market was starting to move then. So that's usually what I'm doing early on. I won't start really diving into, I guess, like my own work and my own numbers until usually June, July, after there's some more player movement. If anything, between now and June, I'll just pick off numbers from places. If I see some sharp books that are hanging a different number than if I find a rogue number on a book that's off a sharp books number, I'll probably put it into pocket in the portfolio. There's always the other aspect of tying up money at this time, and everything that comes with that. So I'm really reluctant to really get involved on stuff unless I'm very confident that I'm going to have a number that's something I can do something with when the season does start. So I don't have much, but I will get more starting June, July, especially when teams head into camp. That's when I'll really start diving in, and I'll take a look at my priors, and then I'll dive into player movement, which is, there's a lot obviously between now and July too. And so then when you get into like which players are going to even make the teams, but obviously you're not going to move the market much at that time with, who's going to make a team is not going to move anything. But coaching, another thing I really pay attention to a lot is coaching changes too. Changes to coaching staffs, not just a change of regime, because that can really give you a lot of clues and give you some edges early on. If you know a certain coach, an offensive coordinator's coming in somewhere and he likes to do things a certain way, you can usually find some good value in the markets on, maybe he likes to, the coach is notorious for check down passes on third down and then just gobbling up, receptions over on like a running backs, little things like that early on that maybe the market's not capturing early on. That's what I try to do. But then usually I would say about 70 to 80% of my season win bets and futures are placed, in that June, July window. You're always rubbing up against it because the market's so mature and it's sharpened out by, even by the time preseason games start. So there is the whole element of beating the market, but I try and find a fine line there. I really take advantage of May to not be doing too much of that stuff.
I think one of the key points you mentioned was having some maneuverability. So using that Jets bet as example, and I'm with you, by the way. I wasn't as quick, didn't get as good of a number as you did, but even a week into March, I was able to grab the Jets 25-1 to win the Super Bowl, 13-1 to win the AFC. And as you talk about having some flexibility with that ticket, not necessarily just sitting on it the whole time, part of me thinks about what I learned from David Malinsky when it comes to hedging. And he wasn't the only one with this point of view, but it was the first time that it really resonated with me. If we're not talking about life-changing money, or if backing off of a position doesn't have positive expected value in its own right, I tend to be inclined not to do it. But at the same time, if you get a big number like this, you can have a lot of flexibility. What's your game plan with that Jets ticket? If they have a good regular season, I'm talking late regular season, potentially early playoffs, if they make it there, how would you look to possibly navigate that position and not just ride it out all the way till the end?
Yeah, I treat it the exact same way. I completely separate from everything else. And then even be able to zone in on like, hey, the Jets ticket exists. Even if we got into the Super Bowl or like in the playoffs, I'm completely treating that as a separate entity, because then you get in the realm of taking negative V bets just to hedge. And then what are you even doing at that point? Maybe the only exception I could think of is if we're so confident in taking the initial position that you did overbet with the intention to hedge. But you're fortunate enough usually to get enough down and enough exposure to even make that a realistic scenario. So what I'll do is I'll treat it completely separately from everything else. And when the season starts, I do suspect that there's a decent chance that the Jets may be overvalued in the market a little bit. So potentially can, I mean, obviously with Circa being here in Illinois, I could probably bet the no on them to win the Super Bowl in ARB, but I'm not looking to do that either, obviously, and especially tying up money for that long. So no, I'll probably sit on it and really not do anything with it. I suspect that if anything, I might be fading the Jets with a regular season win total or something when the season starts. And then I'll be mad at myself when they go over the regular season win and not get bounced in the first round of the playoffs. But I know over time, though, as the process is sound there, I know that in time, rest assured over time that things will treat me well in the long run.
I think you bring up a good point, because if somebody might feel like, hey, I got a great number on the Jets to win the Super Bowl before the Rodgers hype got too big, now you might want to say they could very well be overrated, play a regular season win total under. On one hand, that's kind of a way to hedge out on the big Super Bowl bet. On the other hand, that's not necessarily the most optimal way to play things, because both of those bets could lose. They could sail over the regular season win number and still not win the Super Bowl. So that reminds me of a conversation I had right before this past Super Bowl. I was talking with G-Stack George Silfides, host of the Monday Grind podcast. Highly recommend that as well to any listeners of this show. And he's a pro bettor with a lot of really good process-driven insight. And I was riding a Chiefs future I had taken out at 14-1 last summer, and I wasn't getting off of it. I was just going to let it ride and let the Super Bowl outcome be what it would be. Fortunately, it broke my way, but even if it didn't, I had to be prepared to accept that. And he had a good question for me. He kind of, I think, very politely took me to task and was like, hey, like, why do you have so much exposure on the Chiefs at 14-1 to win the Super Bowl? If that's a bigger financial swing than you'd typically have in a game, you could have taken them to win the AFC, to win the AFC West. There are a lot of other things you can do along the way. So when you mentioned getting the Jets to win the Super Bowl at a big number, did you also do anything? I know coming out of that conversation with George, I also took the Jets to win the AFC, and I didn't see anything enticing with the division, so I left that alone. But have you taken kind of other steps to ensure that, okay, if the Jets do really perform this season, you're not left overexposed if they do happen to make the Super Bowl?
Yeah, no, so I that's a great point too. All of that, I completely agree with it. So I have those 40-1s. I also around the same time as you, maybe it wasn't March 3rd, but it was right around the time the news was announced, or I think it was like right around the Schefter tweet. DraftKings still had 25-1, and I think it was like whatever the equivalent conference title odds and division odds too. So I did gobble up some there at that point. So I don't just have the Super Bowl exposure there, but my thinking was there, and you've preached this on your podcast too. Just because you're not getting the best of it, it doesn't mean it's not a bad bet. And obviously there's exceptions to that for being an NFL game right before kickoff. Most likely going to be over time, you're not going to be netting any sort of profit whatsoever. But in a situation like this, where there's a rogue 25-1 still there, the news is out there. The true odds probably even are maybe closer to 25-1. Maybe there's not much of an edge to be found, but you can be so confident that the market is going to move in your favor. And I don't see any world where the Jets go back to 25-1 unless they start the season out, poorly, which can easily happen. But the confidence that you can have by getting down on those bets, even though it's after the best numbers were taken. I made those bets with way more confidence because I knew Rodgers was going to the Jets, whereas the 40-1 I took, there was a strong likelihood. It's probably maybe it was a 90% baked into the market at that point, 80%. But yeah, there's no wrong way to skin that cat. And I feel like it's very important. That's such a good point that George made on your by putting you to task there, because there's more than one way to attack that type of market, and being able to get down on a division future and everything else to help spread everything around definitely is the way to attack. And honestly, when you're dealing with limits, that's the only way to attack it. If you're only able to get down on the Super Bowl market a certain amount, then you have to find other ways to attack it. And perhaps it's even bringing in the P word that we love so much in order to get down properly.
I might not be able to get you to say the word parlay, but I'll make sure that the audience knows what we're referring to there. And yes, that was an eye-opening experience for me reading The Logic of Sports Betting. I feel like I'm probably a favorite to mention that any given episode, but the notion that yes, they can often be sucker bets, but that's not always the case if you are really attentive to how you're navigating this landscape. And Mike, I want to zoom out a bit and think of the broader landscape. I can get tunnel vision on the NFL at times. That is my bread and butter as a bettor, but we're about to hit, as much as there could be the doldrums of the NFL season, we're pretty much settling into that stage these days. Do you have any other sports betting interests aside from the NFL at this time of year that really keep you active in the space?
Yeah. So the answer is golf, 100% golf. College basketball is my bread and butter, although like NFL and college football, I put right up there as well. I love all those. And NBA, I love watching, but it drives me nuts to try and handicap it, to be honest. I don't do any NBA numbers to try and keep up with that. But golf is the one that I've just really taken on to the past few years. I think that's coincided a lot with just the opportunities that we're seeing. And it's really perfect for betting golf because there's multiple tournaments now. There's that with Live and obviously the DP World Tour presenting a lot of opportunities. But there's an event every weekend, 4 days a week. You have new markets every single day. You have markets. Live markets are fantastic in the regulated market. You can bet live top 20s, live top 10s, live matchups as things are going on. So you could find tons of, especially when you have a lot of books in your. That's where I really wish I lived in like a state like Colorado, New Jersey, where you just have so many more books at your disposal, because you could find so many discrepancies just playing those markets on a day-to-day basis, especially the live markets. But I love golf matchups. It's really something I've been tinkering with as well in terms of like originating too. I'm very much in the early days just playing around with all that, but I've been working to build some golf models with strokes gained analysis. And one of the angles I love too is incorporating weather. I always fancy myself to be a mini meteorologist. My wife's dad actually is like his side hustle is he went back to school and got his meteorology degree. So he's like a fill-in
Whoa.
anchor at Rockford. If people are familiar with the Rockford area here in Chicago, he's a fill-in weatherman there. So hopefully he loves golf. So maybe tap some of that knowledge a little bit just to get a little more confidence into projecting some weather stuff, because I think you can get some nice edges there, especially in matchups, tournament long matchups. You get a guy who's matched up with someone. I mean, this is the easy example, but you get a tournament matchup, obviously which is over the course of 4 days, unless someone's going to get miss the cut after 2 days. But you can find a really favorable market opportunity that's not being priced in properly sometimes when you have a guy who's teeing off, the late Thursday and early Friday, who's going to have a favorable weather edge over a guy who he's matched up against in a market who's teeing off at early Thursday, late Friday. So there's stuff to be found there. Obviously, the market's sharper than it's ever been, but golf really is. I feel like that market, it's experiencing its data revolution, and I want to be part of that in some way, shape, or form. And I think I'm also just bullish on golf from the standpoint, like, these are all younger golfers. This is not going anywhere. It's only arrows pointing up on golf popularity. So we're going to have plenty of opportunity on golf markets for the years to come. So that's the long-winded answer as usual, but golf and some soccer too. I heard you discussing with Timothy Lawson, Better Life, how he's some of his soccer process and stuff too. It's awesome to hear stuff like that, because I think that's similar to golf, arrow pointing up on soccer here in the U.S. It's only going to get more popular, and the leagues just get better. This state of play, the level of competition goes up, and more eyeballs go onto it. When more eyeballs go onto something, there's more money that goes into it, and the markets become more liquid, and you can find better opportunities, higher limits. So I think that's another one I would love to dive into, but I'm so early stages on soccer right now. But that's probably where I would like to turn some of my attention to in the future years around this time of year.
I know another world that you love to dive into from time to time when the opportunity presents itself would be the hoppier side of life. We can weave in that pillar of the podcast at this time. Mike, I know we had you on at this point. I think it was just about 2.5 months ago, shortly after the Super Bowl. In that time, we've seen the seasons change from winter into the heart of spring now. What would you say has been your best drinking experience over the course of that time span?
So I was in Florida last week. My mom's got a little condo down in the Naples area, and they went through the crazy hurricane down there in Southwest Florida last year. So it's cool to see like all the rebuilding going on there. And I came across, it's actually the first, what I believe to be the first tap room brewery, brewery with a tap room in Naples, Florida. It's called Riptide Brewing, and they have another. I think they have another location somewhere in Florida. I forget exactly. Bonita Springs, I want to say. But there's this beer that I had on tap somewhere. It was at a seafood place, of all places, and they had beers on tap. And this is where I came across it. It's called Seafoam Haze, hazy IPA from Riptide Brewing. Had it last week. Could not get enough of it. So if you're down in Florida, I know we're kind of past the spring break time of year, but it was so good. It was juicy and hoppy. They fancy. I'm quoting them here. They say it's silky smooth and perfect for the beach days. That's the way I felt it, because it was, sometimes those beers get, if you're not a seasoned drinker, the hops can be bothersome for some people, maybe rub people the wrong way. But this one, I didn't get that experience drinking it, where I thought it was too hoppy at all. They've cashmere mosaic hops, and came in at 6.3% ABV. So a few of those, you're gonna be feeling pretty good, but it wasn't too heavy. It's perfect for being down at the beach in Florida. So if you're down in Southwest Florida, be on the lookout for Seafoam Haze IPA by Riptide Brewing Company.
I like that recommendation, with a lot of good beach days around the corner for much of the country. There's plenty of shelf life to this suggestion you've got here. And B, when it comes to hazy IPA, they can be very approachable, because, to your point, some of the more classic hop forward beers can be considered resinous and really bitter, and hazy IPA can be much more citrusy, fruity, tropical, a much more creamy mouthfeel. So it's just very approachable as a style. At the same time, with a creamier mouthfeel, sometimes comes a heavier body, sometimes a deceptive ABV, and that can be really fun, but it can also be dangerous if you have a couple and you're used to having a couple beers and just starting to feel it, and suddenly it's almost as if you might have gone too far. But 6.3% ABV, not necessarily sessionable, but you can have a couple and not be too far overextended. And it sounds like it's also, while it has, as they say, a soft, pillowy mouthfeel, based on your tasting notes, not too heavy at the same time. So while some hazy IPAs might weigh people down, this seems like it's a little bit more balanced in that regard.
Yeah, because at the beach, like you don't want something that too heavy. I mean, I'm an IPA guy, especially like after listening to this pod over the years, I just get more educated on them, and it's raised my awareness for IPAs, and I'm doubling down on loving IPA. But yeah, at the beach, that's the last thing you want, is something that's gonna be heavy like that. Like you don't ever see a guy like drinking a porter on the beach, or like one of those thick, like a stout on the beach. But yeah, I feel like you want something that's like right down the middle, and that kind of crossed it for me. Like that, it was like that perfect medium of having a nice hot, like having the hops, having the juiciness, but being drinkable too. I could have pounded a few more if I needed to quickly. You know, you're not gonna play beer pong with those beers, but you could if you had to.
There we go. I love the thinking outside the box with the different possibilities for a beer like that. And it reminds me of a conversation I might have had years ago with the legendary David Malinsky. Mike, let's weave in the Malinsky Minute to wrap up this conversation. Dave passed away 1 month to the day before PASPA was repealed. So as I think of us now being 5 years post-PASPA, that's almost synonymous now with being 5 years post-David Malinsky. And during that time, Mike, I'd be curious for any thoughts you may have on some of the biggest ways that Dave has still, perhaps in any ways, still had an impact on your betting or perhaps your life in general since his untimely passing.
Every day, like I feel like the stuff that we learned from Dave, it rings as true now as it did 5 years ago, and as it did 10 years ago. And the biggest bad beat in U.S. sports betting history, no one knows about this. You know more than anybody. The biggest bad beat for all of us was Dave not being able to be around for the launch and the past 5 years of sports betting, because he would have been such an important piece to this, and like bridging that gap between the uneducated, the regulators, lawmakers, and bettors. Because obviously we don't know a better handicapper that was better and more informed than he was, but also his ability to communicate with people that were not in the know and to put it into terms that they can understand. No one else is like that. So like it was a huge loss for the industry, him not being around. At the same time, we were blessed with all the lifetime of written work and even audio work that he did, that still we could all access today. His teaching still ring as true as they ever have. The market still has not caught up to teams returning home from a long road trip and NBA and especially the NBA. It's still an angle I play. I call it the Malinsky angle. I know Mitch and Paul on Follow the Money still mention it too from time to time, but the market still has not caught up to it. I'm convinced teams coming home from a long road trip, usually my rule of thumb is like a week and a half or longer. And that first game back, all the things that they're human beings just like us, and having to worry about their laundry, or maybe catching up on all the household items that they, obviously they're athletes, they can pay people to do this stuff, but they're also human beings, and they have stuff that they come home to and distractions that keeps them from maybe focusing in on that first game back. That's an angle that I still play all the time, and that's the Malinsky angle. So it's little things like that, but also just the way that he taught us all to think is something that's going to go on forever. So he still had a huge impact on the legal industry, even though he wasn't around to see it. And yeah, and I know I've said this before, but listening to this podcast and hearing you, I hear Dave too. So that's honestly like the best part, is he still lives on through all of us, but really on this podcast especially.
Wow, thank you. That is probably the highest form of praise I could ever imagine for doing the show. So I really want to take a moment to appreciate that. And also to add to your point about the Malinsky angle in the NBA, I would say what comes to mind for me, something that also really blew me away the first time I heard it. And I'm reminded of talking about Dave with Adam Chernoff on this podcast a couple of years ago. A lot of points Dave would make were kind of hidden in plain sight. Like he wasn't just pulling one over on everybody. He was just observing things that we all could have observed, but he would pay more attention and just listen and see the basics better than a lot of us and articulate it in such a clear way. And the angle that comes to me along those lines is college basketball games where there might be an upcoming college football game between the same two teams, and the home team could benefit from a larger home court advantage on the basketball side of things. A specific example I would throw out there, this could be theoretically, but when I was at USC as a student back in the day, there was a home and home with Ohio State. And you know that half of Columbus is coming to the Coliseum for that Buckeyes Trojans game. and it was getting all sorts of attention for the Saturday college football matchup. That said, there are often maybe a Thursday or Friday night basketball game that gets overlooked, but there's just so much more enthusiasm across the student body with a big matchup. And so while half of Columbus might be in town for the football game, I do still feel like the USC in this example would have a much bigger home court advantage with a bigger turnout. Everybody's got all sights set on this big rivalry weekend. It's not just one football game, but there's basketball in play as well. And so instead of a half-empty Galen Center, maybe there's a few more fans for the away team that there would typically be, but there are often way more fans for the home team. So just knowing that, okay, there's this big game happening in football. By the way, there's also this big game happening in basketball a couple days before. That's going to get a bigger turnout. Things that make a lot of sense when I take a step back to think about it, but I just never considered before I came across somebody like Dave.
No, yeah. Sometimes, like you said it perfectly, some of the stuff that's in plain sight is right there, and we're not paying proper attention to it. And some of the stuff we're discussing is worth, maybe it's not even worth a half a point or a point, but as we know, every edge matters in a big way in this business. And those are sometimes edges that are not being properly accounted by the market. And I don't have data to back this up, but I do know I always look to play some of those angles, and it seems to go pretty well. So yeah, I think Dave's he's still earning for us 5 years later.
Yeah. One more example I'll throw out there that comes to mind as we're having this conversation, and I'll be more succinct this time. In college football, a lot of the military academy players come from Texas. So if we've got Army at, at SMU, let's say, SMU should not get its full home field advantage. There should probably be something docked because a lot of these guys that might be playing from a military academy that's, hundreds or thousands of miles away suddenly is playing in front of their family, their friends. There's a big boost there sometimes for the road team. A lot of times in football, what we call home field advantage is really a road team disadvantage, as Dave would have said. And that road team disadvantage can really dissipate when we have certain matchups like that often don't get factored into at all across the betting marketplace.
That's such a good point. Yeah, because at the end of the day, these are human beings, and we treat them. Everyone quantifies and puts a number on everything, as you should in this industry. But sometimes the things that we miss, the qualitative stuff, really is just out there in plain sight, and it just takes a little bit of digging, a little bit of critical thinking and outside thought to arrive at some of that.
Yeah, well, Mike, I appreciate all of the critical thought that you've brought to this conversation, from the legalization side of things to NFL futures to the hops and the Malinsky Minute. Always a blast connecting with you in this forum. To those of you tuning into this conversation, if you're not doing so already, I highly encourage you to follow Mike on Twitter at Michael Roselli. Also check out his podcast, The Doggy Juice Pod. And if you're going to be at Bet Bash in August, odds are you'll catch Mike there if you want to make a proper in-person intro. Although Mike will be on standby for a possible last-minute flight home, as his wife is expecting their first child. So, Mike, congrats to you and Christina on that front. But I look forward to connecting once again in person at Bet Bash, if not sooner.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're expecting a baby boy end of September. As soon as he's able to hold a pencil, or maybe even just like type on a computer, I will have another data entry guy on the team, and he's going to learn. The first thing he's going to learn is about finding plus EV wherever he can, and just finding, edges in the market. He's going to be an insufferable human being that my wife and his mom will not appreciate that aspect, but he'll be another guy to add to the team, and we're really looking forward to it. Right in time for football season too, so I'll be doing those early. I already volunteered myself for early mornings with the baby, because I'll be able to look at the market moves, and I'll be up anyway. So he'll be learning. He'll be learning early.
There we go. I know things are going to be coming at you fast and furious this fall, but appreciate you taking the time to connect in the meantime. And to everybody tuning into this conversation, thank you for your time as well. I will catch you next week right back here on Props and Hops.